60 Minutes with Angela starts right now.
Today says that the current administration of Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari will strive to create a conducive environment for domestic and foreign trade and investment, especially focused on the non-oil economy. He says that the government is committed to improving the ease of doing business in Nigeria. Well, hello and welcome to the program. I am Angela Adjetumobi. Well, he graduated as a medical doctor from Nigeria's University of Nsukka. That was in 1985, and subsequently converted himself into what is called an equity investor. He obtained an MBA from Harvard Graduate School of Business in 1994. He's been a chartered accountant since 1992 and a chartered financial analyst, CFA, since 1997. Dr. Okechukwu Enelamah heads Nigeria's Federal Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment, and he joins me on the program today. Thank you very much, Dr. Enelamah, for coming on the program with me today.
Thank you.
I noticed that your ministry has three sectors: industry, trade, and investment. Were these three sectors always grouped together, or this is the first time that they're being merged?
Well, first, as you probably know, there's a link between the three, which is the progression from, trade to investment to industry. I mean, that's a natural flow of business.
Yes.
But actually it was merged before this administration, even though President Buhari reduced the number of ministries, but even in the previous administration, industry, trade and investment, Nigeria had already recognized the importance of the three being a tripod that had to work in tandem to get the most out of the economy and out of working with the private sector.
Yes. So what would you say is the objective of this ministry?
The objective of the ministry, certainly as we have defined it, or the president has defined it, is, I would say fundamentally to play a catalytic role in diversifying the economy away from, the dependence on oil. Having said that, one of the most important priorities of the ministry and the government is to create the enabling environment for industry, trade and investment to happen.
Okay.
Therefore, as a ministry, we view our role as being very central to supporting, industry, trade and investment. In that respect, we view the partnership with the private sector as very important.
Okay.
We view the support of the micro, small and medium enterprises as very important. We view the linkages between industry, trade and investment as very important.
Okay.
And we view the linkages between Nigeria and the rest of the world as very important, which of course that's what trade is.
Can I just say, for the sake of those who don't know, that your ministry supervises about 16 agencies, and for the viewers out there, I'll just read out the names of those agencies: Bank of Industry, BOI, Standards Organization of Nigeria, SON, Corporate Affairs Commission, CAC, Industrial Training Fund, ITF, Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, FRCN, Nigerian Export Processing Council, NEPC, Nigerian Export Processing Zone Authority, Consumer Protection Council, CPC, Nigerian Commodity Exchange, Nigeria Investment Promotion Commission, NIPC, National Automotive Design and Development Council, National Sugar Development Council, NSDC, Oil and Gas Free Zone Authority, Small and Medium Enterprises Development Agency of Nigeria, SMEDAN, Lagos International Trade Fair Complex Management Board, and the Tafawa Balewa Square Management Board. All these 16 agencies under the purview of the Federal Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment. I mean, how do you harness that scope? Why do you have so many?
The fundamental and perhaps even traditional role of government, as you know,
Yes.
is to provide policy and enabling environment. But for a variety of reasons in a developing country like ours,
Yes.
the government also finds that it needs some implementing bodies, right, for implementing some of its priorities and its policies.
Yes.
And that's where the agencies come in. So the way to think about it is that the ministry itself is very policy oriented and driven, but it then has some implementing agencies. Now let's look at some of them that are here.
Yes.
Bank of Industry. Bank of Industry provides development finance for industry
Right.
and for SMEs. You know, you look at the Small and Medium Enterprises Agency of Nigeria, SMEDAN. Again, it provides capacity building and support for SMEs. You look at the Nigeria Investment Promotion Commission. It's an investment promotion agency for the country. You look at the Nigerian Export Promotion Council. It's concerned with export. You look at the Nigerian Export Processing Zones Authority. It's concerned with industrial parks and just basically creating industrial zones.
Yes.
There's an equivalent one for oil and gas as well.
Yes.
You look at training, you have the Industrial Training Fund. So the whole idea is that like most of these agencies, actually help implement government policies.
Yes.
And the most important thing about these agencies and about the government in general is that it's about service. It's about civil service, it's about public service, it's about client service. I will even go as far as saying, in the sense that like, that's why you've had these recent executive orders. It's very important that we're providing services to people as opposed to, bringing additional burdens to them. And this is something that this government is very particular about.
Okay, so after 3 months as minister, you listed 4 pillars of the vision you and your team had defined and articulated for this ministry. I just want to read the 4 to you. You said, create an enabling environment for industry, trade and investment in Nigeria, implement the Nigerian Industrial Revolution Plan, NIRP, champion the cause of Nigeria's MSMEs as a means of creating jobs and achieving inclusive growth, and attract proactively long-term local and foreign investment. By November 2017, this year, you would have done 2 years as minister. Did this vision change along the way? Is it remain the same?
I would say that that's still the core vision. We've sort of added trade, basically, to play the role of facilitating trade, both local and international trade, because of the centrality and importance of trade in the global era in which we live. We also think that you have to think in terms of institution building and sustainability of your policies. So we have our eye as well on what is the glue that will hold all this together, so that they will last from this government to the next. Because ultimately, our view is that government should continue to serve the people well after this administration. Having said that, if you look at what has happened so far, I think you'll find that in each of those areas we've made serious progress. I mean, if you think about the first one, which is on basically creating the right enabling environment, for industry, trade and investment to thrive, you'll find that like the president has launched the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council. The acting president has issued the first executive order on transparency and ease of doing business and creating an enabling environment. And we've established a secretariat called the Enabling Business Environment Secretariat. We've made significant changes in terms of movement of people, through the airports and the seaports and the goods through the seaports, and any number of other initiatives. There is no question that the momentum is there. And there's a lot to do, but I think most people accept that this is an area where the government has certainly taken some very significant and important steps towards creating the right enabling environment, for the public, for business, for industry, for trade, for investment, and so on. So that's the first thing. If you look at the second pillar, which has to do with basically implementing the Nigeria Industrial Revolution Plan, the government has also launched the Industrial Council, the Industrial Policy and Competitiveness Advisory Council. For, our Industrial Council for short.
Okay.
And that council is a public-private partnership focused on implementing the Nigeria Industrial Revolution Plan, and is met twice already under the chairmanship of the Vice President and Acting President. And we've actually...
You mean it's already existing?
It already exists, yes, and it's met twice already.
Okay.
And in fact, even the meeting with Alhaji Dangote that you would have seen earlier is on the Industrial Council. And the point to make about it is that it's also identified 5 priority areas, that are high impact areas where this council, we believe that a public-private partnership can make a significant difference over the next 12 to 18 months.
What are the 5 areas?
So these areas are, 1, to help to work on critical infrastructure where more can be done. Power, special economic zones, what we call logistics like railways, roads, and so on. So one area, and then of course digital economy as well. So critical infrastructure, just to make sure there's a public-private relationship and partnership driving it. Of course, the government is already doing a lot, but to support that. Number 2 is on skills and vocational training, capacity building. Again, to build a better linkage between our educational institutions, those coming out of them, including our youth that are looking for work, and industry. Again, to make sure there's a public-private partnership. Because if you look at other countries that have done well in this area, they have a tight linkage, or tight set of linkages between the training institutions, the industry where the people work, the trade associations, and of course the students who then become the employees over time. So that you're actually training people for what industry needs. And that, so there's a subcommittee working on that. The third area is on financing. I think most people will tell you that the cost of financing in Nigeria is still high. And if we want to industrialize, we need to find ways of reducing that cost of finance and also providing longer term funding and even what you might call more user-friendly funding, whether it's in terms of the conditions that you need to meet to get the funding, both for big players and for SMEs. Now the fourth area is on trade. And on trade, basically, particularly trading across borders as well as, just facilitating trade. There's a lot of issues around trade agreements. The ECOWAS trade agreements like CET, the trade agreements between ECOWAS and Europe, like what we call the Economic Partnership Agreement, the Intra-Africa Trade Agreement called the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and so on and so forth. So things to do with trade and also things to do with facilitating trade, including trading across borders, is the fourth area. The final area is around policy. The policy environment that encourages industrialization. Things like smuggling, and tackling the stubborn problem of smuggling will come under policy. How do you make sure the policies are not only user-friendly, but are also implemented in a way that people don't take undue advantage? Like, for instance, there are some things we put tariffs on because we want to discourage cheap imports and what you might call substandard goods from coming in, so that you can develop local industry. And yet you find that those things still find their way in. So all those things, just working on them on a public-private or a private-public basis or public-private partnership basis is at the heart of the work of this council. So that's the second pillar, industrialization. Now, the third pillar, which is on micro, small, and medium enterprises, we have several initiatives going on there. We have the Bank of Industry that has several programs is running for SMEs. We have the special intervention or social intervention program of the government, which is partly, part of which is run by the Bank of Industry, GEEP. We have some programs we're running in collaboration with the World Bank called the Growth and Employment Projects, where we basically provide funding, GEM projects, provide funding for SMEs. Of course, we have the training by ITF, Industrial Training Fund, the capacity building by SMEDAN, Small and Medium Enterprises Development Agency of Nigeria. And I must say that even the SME clinics, which the acting president and vice president has been championing from state to state, is also we're also the focal ministry for that. And let me also say that a lot of the things on ease of doing business and creating right enabling environment also targets SMEs. In fact, the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index is specifically focused on SMEs. So we've been working actively to make sure that SMEs get a better ecosystem, they get more funding support, they get more capacity building. I will always say that the need is far greater than what we've already done, but I think the trajectory and the trend is definitely positive. So that's the third one. The fourth one, which is on investment, attracting investments. The focal agency there is the Nigeria Investment Promotion Commission. We recently appointed, well, not recently actually, because it's getting close to a year. At the end of last year, we appointed a new DG, or a new Executive Secretary CEO from the private sector, Yewande Sadiku. She's helped to sort of strengthen NIPC, and they've been working very collaboratively with the Enabling Environment Council, as well as the Economic Management team, to attract investment, both domestic and foreign. And in fact, later this year in October, they're planning a very important investment summit, where we'll attract both leading private sector investors internationally and locally, both from the international community and the domestic investors. And also there are things like the pioneer status.
Yes.
They are basically relaunching, and we're going to be relaunching that in the next few weeks. We've added trade, facilitating trade. And one of the most important initiatives there, in addition to negotiating all kinds of agreements, is that we've established a Nigeria Office for Trade Negotiations, because the trade is very specialized, that it needs experts. And we've appointed an expert who was already advising the government, advising us as a ministry, as a negotiator, what we call a chief trade negotiator, as well as trade advisor, or chief negotiator and trade advisor. Now he's going to head an office called the Nigeria Office for Trade Negotiations. And the whole idea is to make sure that a body of experts, a group of experts who advise across ministries, department, agencies of government, whenever we're dealing with negotiations or trade or even investment negotiations. We're also relaunching the EEG, the Export Expansion Grants, which was stopped a few years ago. So there are several things we're doing. All of these are reform, initiatives that we hope will basically create a better environment for business and for the economy.
Join us again after the break.
Nice question.
Angela, that's a great question.
It's a good question.
It is difficult to respond to that question.
That is a serious question.
Angela, that is a very great question.
Great question, Angela.
Angela, that's a very difficult question.
That's a great question, Angela.
Okay, that's a great question.
Angela, that's a tough one for me.
That's a good question. Good question.
60 Minutes with Angela. Again, answers to every question you always wanted to ask.
So what is 60 Minutes with Angela all about? It's not an interview. I like to think it's a conversation between two people making the news, people who are in the news, and those who become the news. And the whole idea is to inform, to educate, or to clarify, as the case may be. It is an art getting people to answer the questions that everyone is thinking in their minds. And that's what we try to do on 60 Minutes with Angela. I ask all the questions that everyone's thinking about and no one wants to voice. All the questions you always wanted to ask, you get those answers on 60 Minutes with Angela. Every week on this station, 60 Minutes with Angela, getting answers to every question you always wanted to ask. Welcome back. If you've just joined us, it's 60 Minutes with me, Angela Ajetomobi. On my hot seat today, Nigeria's Federal Minister for Industry, Trade and Investment, Dr. Okechukwu Enelamah. Let's talk about investment incentives. What role is the Nigeria Investment Promotion Council expected to play?
So the Nigeria Investment Promotion Commission, NIPC, its role fundamentally is to facilitate, encourage, promote investments. It does this in a range of ways.
Yes.
Both from basically providing information on the investment opportunities available in the country, to engaging investors, both existing and prospective.
Yes.
To providing them incentives, right? Of which pioneer status is probably one of the most visible, by no means the only one.
Yes.
To what you call after investment care, providing basically problem solving, troubleshooting,
yes.
which is why it has a real partnership and synergy and alignment with what we're doing in the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council and the Enabling Business Environment Secretariat that is housed within NIPC. So it's all around making sure investors have the right enabling environment to keep investing, to grow their businesses, and in an environment that is friendly.
And with the ease of doing business index now being properly considered, what can you tell us of our visa policy and expatriate quota requirements?
So one of the areas we focused on is how to systematically remove the bottlenecks, to investors. It's one thing to say you want investors. It's
Yes.
another thing to give them the documents they need to come in. Because, clearly, actions speak louder than words. And one of the most important is visas. So we've taken several steps. The Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has written all the missions and embassies of Nigeria to say visas must be issued within 48 hours. It's also part of the presidential order, executive order.
I'm assuming that all the documentation is complete that
but
you're bringing forward.
That's always the assumption, by the way. Even when you deal with, even for the private sector, when somebody says, I act within, it assumes that, and it's important to make that point because you have to assume that the people will bring the documents and that it's, and I think that's what will happen. But you are correct, assuming they bring their documents. But that should not be used as an excuse. Because if not, you can always say the person hasn't brought the documents. By the way, that's why the executive order includes that if documents are needed from government, from other government agencies and ministries and departments, then it should be expected that the government will provide it, not the candidate or the
Not throwing
applicant.
it back to the applicant saying you don't have this document.
Absolutely, that's very important. That's why I talked about the need for public service and the civil service to be responsive. So if you go back to the visa issue, we also now have visa on arrival. We also have cleared the airport of touts and a lot of the so-called protocol officers that clog the wheel of the airport running smoothly. So I think most people, we've gotten a lot of messages from people saying
it's
the airports
working.
are changing and it's working. But Rome was not built in a day. We expect that this progress will continue. We're very determined. We'll have the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council meeting again tomorrow.
Yes.
It meets monthly under the supervision of the Vice President and Acting President.
For the sake of those watching now, when you say visa on arrival, how does one qualify to have a visa on arrival?
So first of all, there's an online information process which is there, and we're trying to keep simplifying that. So basically, you apply online, and then it will then tell you that the visa will be completed when you get here. But it also has the ability to deal with qualifying cases, business people really primarily, targeting business. When you get here, it's just it's always good to have made contact before you get here, so that it's not a surprise. We want to avoid negative surprises.
And the expatriate quota requirements?
Expatriate quota, as you know, is an attempt to make sure that the foreigners working in the country are properly documented, and that the positions they are filling are not positions that ordinarily should be available to Nigerians. We have a lot of unemployed people, so it's something we take seriously. Having said that, we should also make it user-friendly, because it's issued by the Ministry of Interior, and that is also something that the executive order on ease of doing business applies to it, and I think you'll see progress there.
There's some other essential incentives that Nigeria provides that give guarantees. For instance, transferability of funds by an investor. We've had stories in the news about people who can't move their monies out of the country.
Well, I think one of the issues there has to do with the foreign exchange availability, right? And one of the realities that we faced when we came in was that with the economy not being well diversified in terms of foreign exchange earnings and in terms of government revenues, that we simply didn't have enough foreign exchange for all the needs of the various sort of players in the economy. And as a result, some of them, had to wait to get their money out. But the good news is that government has responded to that. We have now created sort of what we call an investment and export window, IFEX, which basically makes it easier, right, for willing buyer, willing seller, for the market to use market mechanisms to provide extra funding. And I think so far the market has responded very positively to that. I mean, dollars are, again, fairly available. I think you've seen even the banks beginning to advertise again that please travel with your Naira debit cards and charge whatever you want over there. So I think it's a matter of basically responding to the crisis we have faced in a way that we come out of it stronger, more resilient, more robust in terms of the economy. And frankly, that's what we're working towards.
All right. And guarantees against expropriation, what specifics there?
Well, first, when you talk about expropriation, it's something that is almost like not been heard of in Nigeria for decades.
Yes.
So I think we are well past that. So I don't think I can't think of any investor has come to me that their biggest risk is risk of expropriation.
Yes.
Having said that, we signed something they call Investment Protection and Promotion Agreements, IPPAs, with both countries, and strategically that will include avoiding the risk of expropriation, even if it's remote.
Yes.
Now, there are regulatory risks and other risks that people consider equally risky, like things like government interference and so on. So we clearly are prepared to work with different sectors. And in fact, even the World Bank has an agency called MIGA, that their job is just to provide investment guarantees to those doing large infrastructure projects in countries like Nigeria that are concerned about government actions interfering with their investments. We also have all kinds of investment agreements. But in general, we pride ourselves on respecting private property rights.
On taxation, are we offering tax holidays to certain sectors?
Absolutely. When I talk about pioneer status, it's essentially a tax incentive scheme, a tax holiday scheme. And what it does is to say that for sectors we want to promote, and also we want to promote even expansion, that people are allowed, up to 5 years of tax holidays. In addition to that, we have various other tax incentives for particular sectors. Right.
Such as?
Well, first let's start with the special economic zones and industrial parks. When you're in there, you have tax holidays that are long lasting. You would have heard of things like tomato policy, the sugar policy, the cement policy. These are all areas where we provided extra incentives and duty waivers, right, to sectors just to promote Nigerian investment, agriculture. So in all these areas, you find that we have a good basket or a good set of incentives that we make available. The important thing is to make sure these things are well implemented and that we don't put obstacles in the way of people. Because, for people, you can have an incentive, but if it's very hard to get it, it's a problem. The other thing to also say, I talked about export expansion grants, which is an incentive we give to exporters. I talked about pioneer status, an incentive we give to investors who are investing here. All these things were suspended at some point by the previous government, and this government is restarting all of them this year. And I think it's to the credit of this government.
Any reason why we stopped it?
They stopped them because of what they viewed as abuse. In other words, people were coming up with all kinds of documentation, and the claims were running way ahead of the resources to service those claims. And I think the government, maybe rightly so, started to question whether the documentation was authentic or even the policy wasn't being abused by all kinds of players. There were cases where people would get, for instance, the duty allowances or waivers from the EEG, Export Expansion Grant, and they will reuse them, just
keep going and
keep reviewing the thing. And they were meant to be used once and they expire. So you're buying a ticket, and after flying, next year you bring the same ticket
again.
Anytime you're traveling, you bring the same ticket, and instead of the thing being stamped and even torn.
You mentioned tomato now. Let's talk about tomatoes. Nigeria imports an average of 150 metric tons a year, and tomato concentrate, we spend $170 million bringing that in. Why is that?
So I think it's a very good question, and that's why we launched recently a tomato policy. Let me start from the beginning. First, tomato happens to be something that grows very well in Nigeria, in fact, across almost all the states of Nigeria, particularly the northern states. So clearly we can grow all the tomato we need, both for the ones that are consumed without further processing and fresh, and the ones that are processed to tomato concentrate and eventually that end up on, for cooking and so on. But what had happened was that because of the flooding of the country with cheap tomato paste, some of which is substandard, some of which is sort of playing games with duties and everything, we found that people were finding it hard to compete locally. So what we've done is to issue a new tomato policy that bans the import of, first of all, retail tomato paste, because clearly that should be produced there. And even for the so-called packers, that's those who bring in industrial paste and then pack it here. We have basically said they have to pay extra duties. We've raised the duties by 50%. With the idea that, there is, and then of course there's also a levy of $1,500 per ton. With the idea that it's the scale is now very much in favor of local production. And I think we've already seen the signal. The plants, processing plants that are here, are going back to work. People are basically retooling their plants. And we're also working on the value chain in terms of financing, in terms of the quality of the seeds, in terms of what we call greenhouse equipment that allow people to grow tomato all the year round.
Yes.
And there's a government, there's a committee, public-private committee, that includes the Central Bank, Ministry of Agriculture, of course, Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment, and private sector players working on the implementation. Yeah. Of course, this policy was announced about 2 months ago.
So it's still relatively new.
It's new, but it's working. It's off to a good start. We've gotten good feedback from the private sector.
Are there any fears, though, that what we grow will not be sufficient by the time we start processing into paste and concentrate? There's a general fear out there that then the ordinary man on the street won't have enough tomatoes to eat.
I think there are several points to make on that. First is that, they say necessity is the mother of invention. We grow enough tomatoes. If the demand is there, the tomatoes will grow it. And it grows in 3 months. And that's the cycle.
That's the lifespan, yes.
From planting to harvest. Secondly, we haven't stopped people from bringing in the paste. We've said that you pay more if you bring it in.
Okay.
So that you shift the incentive to growing it here. So that even the man who is bringing it in will ask himself again, we're not better off just processing the ones that are here. So in effect, we're trying to say that importing paste is a luxury thing, when we can grow it locally.
Yes.
By Niger. And I think people like that. Now, there are a few people who are sort of traders, what I call traders that are just not prepared to get into any value addition. They'll say they'll rather trade, then they'll pay more.
You were recently in Germany. You represented the president at G20. Give us an update on that. What were we hoping to achieve?
So there's something called the G20 Africa Compact, which is basically an attempt by the G20 countries to work with Africa using primarily private sector mechanisms and solutions to deal with their most challenging needs, be it infrastructure, or in the area of policy, or in the area of growing your economy, whatever your issues are. They have a menu of about maybe 13 things you can pick from. So the whole idea is to create an attempt for African countries to pick what where they think they can work with the international community, the multilateral agencies, and the private sector. So I went to represent the president. I was asked to represent the president, and Nigeria had not signed up initially because we wanted to see whether this was just one more of these things that you get from these multilateral agencies, the World Bank, IMF, and so on. But from what we can see, we think it can be interesting. So clearly, we are reporting back to the president that we should consider, signing up to that pact. But I would say that it was a very good outing. It certainly was very well attended. It was hosted by the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, and it was a very good showing, both for us and for the entire outing.
The Nigerian Office for Trade Negotiation, Industrial Council, give us an update on that as well.
So there are two things you've mentioned. Nigerian Office for Trade Negotiation, which is basically a new agency, really, and a new platform that the government is setting up with a view to, making sure we have experts that will guide all our negotiations. So that first of all, the priorities of the country are focused on. What we call a coordination deficit is addressed, where people are working in silos and in different ways without really taking care of what you might call national interest. Also, like I said earlier, trade and investment, for that matter, also are all sort of very technical areas that require a lot of expertise. The gentleman that is heading this is somebody who had been with the WTO for well over 15, going to 20 years.
That's the World Trade Organization.
World Trade Organization, yes. And also before then spent many years in foreign service. So he's a trade expert. And of course, other experts are going to work with him to advise us as a country and the MDAs whenever we have things to negotiate. That's, of course, I've talked about Industrial Council earlier.
And what can you tell us about the Continental Free Trade Agreement, CFTA?
So the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is basically something that the summit, the AU summit, the African Union summit, which is the heads of state of the African Union, decided that we must focus on increasing intra-Africa trade. Right now it's in the teens, maybe 15%, give or take. If you look at the developed world, the Western world, and even Asia, it ranges from as low as 30-something% to the 60s, if not higher. And clearly, it means that a lot of value is being transferred out of Africa, and we're clearly not tapping into the synergies that should exist amongst African countries and African neighbors. So the whole idea is to, again, for a group of experts to come up with an agreement, or at least the framework of an agreement for increasing intra-Africa trade.
Yes.
And the summit of, or the heads of states and heads of government of Africa, of AU, have asked for the first draft of this by the end of this year. It's very ambitious. That's why they've been meeting. They've met 6 or 7 times already. And of course, the whole idea is, again, that both this new trade office, as well as Ministry of Industry and Investment, as well as a council,
Yes.
there's an interministerial council also with the private sector, are working very hard to come up with Nigeria's input into this framework agreement that is being developed. But we believe it's good for Africa, but it will take a lot of work because, as you know, these agreements also have to be implemented after they are agreed.
Yes. Join us again after the break.
Nice question.
Angela, that's a great question.
It's a good question.
It is difficult to respond to that question.
That is a serious question. Angela, that is a very great question.
Great question, Angela.
You know, Angela, that's a very difficult question.
That's a great question, Angela.
Okay, that's a great question.
Angela, that's a tough one for me.
That's a good question. Good question.
60 Minutes with Angela. Again, answers to every question you always wanted to ask.
So what is 60 Minutes with Angela all about? It's not an interview. I like to think it's a conversation between two people making the news, people who are in the news, and those who become the news. And the whole idea is to inform, to educate, or to clarify, as the case may be. It is an art getting people to answer the questions that everyone is thinking in their minds. And that's what we try to do on 60 Minutes with Angela. I ask all the questions that everyone's thinking about and no one wants to voice. All the questions you always wanted to ask, you get those answers on 60 Minutes with Angela. Every week on this station, 60 Minutes with Angela, getting answers to every question you always wanted to ask. Welcome back. My concluding moments now with Nigeria's Federal Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment, Dr. Okechukwu Enelamah. The United States Africa Business Summit, which held in Washington, D.C. What did you achieve with that summit?
So that summit was hosted by or sponsored by a group called the Corporate Council on Africa, which hosts, like you said, this US Africa Business Summit. Yeah. And the whole idea, again, is basically to meet with, I would say, majority US investors, but also potentially investors from other countries. And then also to meet with US, because it was held in Washington, to meet with US government representatives. And then also to market Nigeria, and also to, frankly, make sure all these initiatives were shared, that the message is getting out. Because people often say government needs to communicate more what it's doing, so that people will know those changes that are good for them and good for the economy, so that they can key in. And all these things were achieved. We were there for a few days. We had meetings with the private sector players who attended the conference. We spoke at the conference. We met with some key U.S. government agencies and departments. And I would say came back with a real sense that there's a good and strong relationship between Nigeria and the U.S. And we will just keep reinforcing and building on it.
I'm surprised you say that there's a good, strong relationship between Nigeria and the United States. Are we not going to be affected by this America First policy?
Well, first, let me say that my statement comes from the point of view of the historical ties, which have been very strong, and also the current realities. Remember that President Trump, one of the first, in fact, the first African president, one of the first 2 African presidents he called, is President Buhari.
Yes.
And in calling him, they've been sending a signal since. They had a good conversation. They've been sending a signal ever since that, frankly, they consider Nigeria one of the most important strategic countries for them.
Yes.
And they reinforced this message in the meeting they held with us, the Department of Commerce. We met with senior executives of the Department of Commerce, and they reinforced the message. We've also been engaging, sort of the U.S. embassy here. The new ambassador, Stuart Symington, very experienced diplomat and ambassador, is working very well with us. So I would say on a bilateral level, the relationship is very good. But clearly, the world is watching what America first means. And ultimately, you'll find that what will be good for America is what they call enlightened first self-interest, because no nation can exist in isolation today. So I'm sure the US will eventually cooperate with other nations.
You started out as a medical doctor. Did you ever practice medicine?
Just to put it in perspective, I qualified as a medical doctor in 1985, so you're talking about 32 years ago. And so, yes, I did house job, 85, 86, in youth service, 86, 87, and
Yes.
I worked for probably just about a year. And then I joined the accounting firm of Arthur Andersen,
Yes.
which used to be an American, blue chip firm. And that's where I trained as an accountant. So I did practice for a few short years,
Yes.
but I've been in business for close to 30 years.
Did you know President Buhari before you were appointed?
Of course, I knew of him. As you know, he's been president before, and he's clearly one of the most respected leaders in Nigeria, even before this second coming. But I would admit I was not a politician, so I clearly did not campaign as APC and all that. But as a business person and somebody who had built a successful business in Nigeria and also even before then in South Africa, when he started picking ministers, when he got to Abia State, he wanted an economic minister, a minister with an economic background. And a number of his very senior Igbo leaders contacted me and introduced me to him. And that's how he invited me to join his cabinet, yes.
When he delegates to you, what is he like? Does he look over your shoulder? Does he try to prod you in a certain direction? Or does he leave you to your own devices?
Well, first, let me say that as a leader, he's somebody that wants to work with people who, like you said, you delegate to them and they carry out the assignment and they come back. So he's not a micromanager, if that's your question. Certainly, to the extent I've worked with micromanagers, I think you'll be hard-pressed to call President Buhari a micromanager. Secondly, he's also a very visionary leader in the sense that he knows where he's going. So if you look at his vision for the country, peace and security, the war against corruption, and to revitalize and rebuild the economy and diversify the economy, he's been very consistent. He stayed with that message. So there's no lack of clarity on where he thinks we should go. Then finally, I will also say that in terms of just prioritizing, he was very clear on how to deal with the issue of security, and has done it extremely well. He was very clear on the fact that he hates corruption with a passion. In fact, he made the famous expression, "If we don't kill corruption, corruption will kill us." And you can see that even the responses have been such that clearly it's not business as usual. And then I would say from the point of view of the economy, which I've been very actively involved in, he certainly has supported the policies we've come up with. And all the examples I gave you were approved by him: the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council, the Industrial Council, Nigerian Office for Trade Negotiations, and so on and so forth. So he's clearly provided leadership, and he's somebody that is, highly respected both internationally and locally. I was in Ethiopia a few weeks ago, and they just couldn't stop singing his praises. So, I think he provides leadership, and Nigeria needs leadership. We don't lack for people who are competent, who have the capacity to work, but we need purposeful, visionary leadership, and I think that's what the president provides.
You think he lacks democratic credential? Does he have the capacity to lead a democratic Nigeria at this time?
So, I'm smiling because if somebody went to the electorate 4 times before he's elected a leader, I don't know what else he needs to do to show democratic credentials. I think that's massive. And then secondly, he's made the point that even the fight against corruption, the war against corruption, because he wants to respect the rule of law and also work with the system. We have a system where you have the judiciary, the National Assembly, and the executive. That's why at times the war appears slow. So I think in terms of democratic credentials, I believe that he's done well and continues to do well.
So tell us about the 81 young innovators. They've received 756.3 million naira. Who are these 81? How were they chosen? Did they have to be members of the APC, for instance?
So I told you about the things we're doing for the micro, small, and medium enterprises. One
Yes.
of them is something called the Growth and Employment Project, GEM project, right? Which is an attempt to basically fund SMEs across several sectors.
Right.
Now, one of the sectors that we took an interest in because of just what we saw with the demo that was led by the presidency, by the president and the vice president, where they got young innovators in technology to come and demonstrate what they could do. But after that demo, which was very successful, remember this is when Mark Zuckerberg came?
Yes.
That same day there was a demo, if you remember.
Yes.
The next question was really, but who's going to fund these brilliant entrepreneurial innovators?
Yes.
And, so it turns out that the GEM project had funding, that could be, provided they qualified in terms of, doing things that are really meaningful.
Yes.
So basically, we went through a process, but the short answer is that like, these were Nigerian youth from all backgrounds. I don't think their party members that we certainly didn't ask, who had brilliant ideas that needed to be supported and were supported. And of course, the acting president also, the vice president and acting president currently also played a role in sort of inaugurating them and launching them, and so we're happy with that initiative.
Where did we get the money from?
The money came from the World Bank, but it's a loan to Nigeria actually. But it's a grant to them. So it's a long-term funding that World Bank provides to Nigeria as part of all the sort of World Bank mission initiatives and so on. There's a part of the funding that is meant for micro, small, and medium enterprises.
Well, on a final note now, in January this year, 2017, you submitted our acceptance ratification of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, TFA. We were the 107th member, I was told, of the World Trade Organization to ratify that. So why is there a seeming hesitation on the part of many countries to ratify? Is it that the TFA is not beneficial?
First, talking about the Trade Facilitation Agreement, it's actually quite remarkable and symbolic in the sense that it's one of the few agreements, like that is sort of consequential, an agreement that really will have an impact that has come out of the World Trade Organization in the last few years.
Yes.
And the reason is that for something to be an agreement from the WTO, all the members have to consent. It's an organization that works by consensus.
Okay.
So you can imagine with all the trading blocks and all the issues.
All coming together.
But Trade Facilitation Agreement is an example of an agreement that people know is win-win. Because basically what it says is that why don't you remove the additional layers of cost, both inside the country and across countries for trade. Because trade can be a force for good. It can create employment. And we're talking about intra-trade. Look at Nigeria.
Yes.
Why is food cost so high? It's trade. All the bottlenecks along the way from the north where the food is produced to maybe some parts of the south where it's consumed. So all those things come under trade facilitation. And Nigeria clearly believes then and now that it's in our interest to remove those bottlenecks to trade, particularly for export, particularly for intra-Nigeria trade and so on and so forth. The next thing also is that for the agreement, to come into force, 2/3 of the members of the WTO have to ratify. And so that's where Nigeria comes in. Yeah. The reason it takes some time for some countries, including us at the beginning, is that it has different categories of things you have to accept and commit to. And if you're wise, you don't accept something until you're sure you can do it.
Yes.
And of course, there's also the whole process of getting approvals from the council and so on. So we went through all that, and eventually I'm glad that we're one of the original countries that ratified the agreement. In other words, to get to that 2/3 threshold, Nigeria was one of the countries that helped get WTO and the members to that threshold. So we're proud signatory to the TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement. We're now busy with implementation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Enelamah, for having us in your office.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. I'm Angela Ajetumobi.